Welcome to the Outer Realm with Michelle DeRoche and Amelia Pisano. Airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday night segment of the Outer Realm. We are broadcasting not live on the United Public Radio Network. This evening, you are listening to a pre-record. So you are finding us, however, on the United Public Radio Network, UFO Paranormal Radio Network 105.3 and 107.7 FM from the beautiful city of New Orleans. We're fully sponsored by the amazing people over at Folgers Coffee who have been a part of our journey since the very beginning, and that's a few years now. So thank you, Folgers. We appreciate you so very much and couldn't do it without you, nor would we want to. Also, big thank you to Justin Snicker, aka Dr. Snick, the Sonic Surgeon, for his contribution of his time, his voice, and his music for the intro that you just heard. He's an award-winning composer of Halloween, horror, sci-fi, and dark wave electronic music, which can be found on any of your favorite listening music platforms. Also, big thank you to Steve McGinnis, the artist behind all of the banners and logos here at the Outer Realm. Check him out on Facebook and Instagram. Also specializes in the horror genre, horror movies, graphic novels, comic books, you name it, he does it. Anyway, I've had the pleasure today of spending the afternoon, and we, of course, have him on often, and we love him. Mark Olly, all the way from the UK, and he's going to be discussing his book, The Life and Times of the Real Robyn Hood. I know. You're like, what? Here we go. Bring on our special guest. Hi.
Hi, great to be back.
Oh, we love having you back. So, thing is about doing the pre-record is I have you all to myself.
Hey.
You ever make it? I know. It's hard. But I have been waiting for this because we were going to do this a couple of times and then ended up bouncing around and switching things up. And I tell you, Robyn Hood, I grew up with Robyn Hood. So when I saw your book, you said, well, we're going to talk about the real Robyn. I'm like, what? I don't know. The fairy tale guy's pretty cool. So I guess, let's start with who was he? What we're reading, it's a facade.
Well, it's funny because I've done two books on what you would call legendary characters. And one is Robyn Hood and the other is King Arthur. And I started from a different place with both of them, because very much like everybody over here, especially in the UK, we all sort of assume Robyn Hood, is probably just some guy that was made up, in some point in history. But then King Arthur, everyone kind of thinks, yeah, there's a possibility that, maybe that person was real. And the more that I actually plowed into both of those characters, the more I discovered that there's a huge amount of nonsense talked about King Arthur. So that took years, absolutely years to sort that book out.
It took you 50 years? That whole interview, guys, you got to go back and watch it. It was mind-blowing.
45 years to get into print, so it was a ridiculous amount of stuff. But eventually we sort of got there in the end. But Robyn Hood was a different kettle of fish. Once I started getting into Robyn Hood, I started to realize that actually, it's only medieval times. So in archaeological terms, you're only talking about something that's happened in the last 1,000 years, which is not that long when it comes to archaeology. Right. And there are records that have survived. So the more I started plowing into this, the more I thought, you know what? There's just a possibility this guy might be real.
So what made you want to delve into it? Is it your archaeology background? Like, I understand King Arthur because, oh my God, he gets beaten to death. Robyn Hood sort of takes the back seat a little bit to the King Arthur and, that whole thing.
I ended up working with a producer. I can get a quick plug in, actually.
Yes, let's do that.
we decided we were gonna produce this. Now these are quite scarce now because these are the DVDs, but you can still get them. I believe they are still available online, so you can get them. We did a really good job of them, actually. We just got an inside as well and all that. So
beautiful.
I work with a producer guy called Brian Lomax, and when we've been working together ages. He's one of the two producers that form Mythco. Mythological company, which is my production company. Okay. And you go all the way back to sort of, we started working in 2006 on a project then. And he was going through me books and he was saying, well, maybe we could do this one, maybe we could do that one. And then he got to this point where he said, look, you've been talking about doing something on Robin Hood, so why don't you actually go ahead and do it and we'll see where it goes. Well, it kind of, you've got the 40-year span of Arthur, but we managed to do sort of Robin Hood in the space of 4 years. So the entire book from start to finish, all the research, everything that went into that, and then moving on to producing it as as a DVD release and a documentary. The whole process only took 4 years. But where I live, we're actually next door, in effect, to Nottingham. So you've only got to sort of drive, 50 miles.
So that was easy for you.
Well, yeah,
than your usual stuff, right?
Yeah. It was
not like you could go find Camelot just like that without research.
No. I mean, if you decided to do that, you'd have to, if you didn't think it was in Wales, you went looking for Camelot, you'd finish up down south, which is 400 and odd miles away.
Right.
Whereas we've got Cheshire, which is where I live. Well, next door to that's Derbyshire, and next door to that's Nottinghamshire. Right. So it's only going across. You're not going that far to do it. So I started off on the research and very, very quickly started stumbling over things that began as coincidences. So you'd be looking at the legends and you'd line all the legends up and you'd think, well, hang on a minute, it says here he killed the Sheriff of Nottingham. And then you'd look at the Sheriff of Nottingham list. Oh, look, there's a sheriff there who died in office. And then a few years later, you'd find, somebody else, Little John came and he killed the sheriff. And then you'd look at the actual archaeological records and you go, hang on a minute, there's another sheriff there who's died around the same time. You start piecing these together. Mm-hmm. So what I ended up doing, I did it. I mean, I call the Arthur book a polychronicon, which is a chronological history. Yes. It's actually the second version of that has come into print. The original polychronicon that I was working on was this Life and Times of the Real Robin Hood. So it runs a bit like a diary. Again, you can read it from start to finish.
So it makes it's user friendly, like it's easy to read. Reader friendly, shall we say? Like they could do and further their own research if they were curious, based on the way you have it laid out.
Yes, yeah, and basically, I've put it in chronological order. Beautiful. Also, I've tried to put in there the major medieval events. So when the king changes, or the queen changes, or there's crusades, or there's geographical alterations,
which is like all cross-referencing, realistically, which you need.
Yeah. But as soon as you start to read it, you read it as it almost reads as a life story. And as I say, the interesting part of it was the more I ploughed into it, the more it started fitting in with what is known as recognised history. Yeah, that's it. That's the one.
There it is.
Life and Times of the Real Robin Hood. Yeah, that's it. That's the one.
Right.
I can tell you a bit of trivia while the image is on there as well. Over here, we had... We had an amazing television story called television series called Robin of Sherwood, and written by a guy called Kip, who's very famous as a scriptwriter. And that sword on the cover comes from that television series, 1980s series, Robin of Sherwood. I mean, it's accurate, it's correct for the time, but it was made for that series. So probably most people won't realise that. But
I love it. I love the background as well. It looks like it's all embroidered.
Yeah. Well, it's that greenery, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's a how can I put it? It's sort of it's an Eastern medieval sort of tapestry pattern. I actually took that photo for the cover, so it's my design. They changed the typeset slightly, but apart from that, and you'll notice Templar crosses.
First thing I noticed, just saying.
Yeah.
I have a feeling we're going to do a bit of a crossover, I hope.
Yeah, we'll float in that direction. Yeah, we'll float in that direction.
Excellent. All right. So,
well, One of the places to start, I suppose, was people were saying, this guy isn't real. And a lot of historians had done research and said, well, maybe he was alive in the 1300s, or maybe he was alive in the 1200s. A very small number of them said, well, maybe he's alive in the 1100s. Well, when you actually string everything together and you start to make sense of it all, you can actually, believe it or not, pinpoint his birth date. He was born probably in the winter of 1129 or the spring of 1130. So we can actually pin him down. Part of that is engineering things backwards. If you start to look at the things that are going on, and who he met and what he did and things like that, you can work it out. That's I'm going to nail my colours to the mast and say that's when he was born, in the winter of 1129 going into 1130.
Right. That's amazing, because they sure don't. They sure make it look like it's more, later medieval for the most part when you're looking at some of the old films, shall we say?
Well, I can tell you how that's come about.
Okay. Yeah,
I mean, the 1100s makes sense, because if he's in that time period, you've just passed the First Crusade, so you're heading for the Second Crusade, and there's a lot of links between him and the Third Crusade. So he's got to be around, sort of going just out of the 1100s into the start of the 1200s. You've also got this idea that he's met with Richard the Lionheart. So obviously the two people's lives have got to overlap. So when you start looking at that, you begin to realize very quickly, well, he's got to be alive in the 1100s. He has to be. Most people, most of the other historians have gone slightly later. They've reckoned 1150s, 1160s, because they think he's younger further on. And this is what the explanation I'm coming to. There's a tradition, and it's known by medieval scholars, that if you're born and your name, let's say, is Robin Hood, you then marry and produce a son, then your eldest son's name will be Robin Hood.
Okay. And then that could confuse things, for sure.
Yeah, that person's eldest son can also be called Robin Hood. Now, the reason I know this is, and this is common, I've done my family history, and I think there's 12 Johns, one after another, and they span like 300 years of, John the First, John the Second, John the Third. And it's this practice of calling your eldest son by your name. Now, we know that he has a son by Marion, who's also known in some of the legends as Clorinda. They get married and they have a son, and the eldest son is Robin Hood II. Now, Robin Hood II is alive in the 1200s. So, knowing that, it helps to make sense of this sort of mishmash of Robin Hoods. And funnily enough, and this is another good thing as well, when you start looking through the records, and you see like, there was a Robert Hoode that was, done for stealing in the 1200s. And then there's somebody else called Hoode that's done a bit later on. And then all of a sudden, by the 1300s, there's loads of people popping up all over the country called Robin Hood or Robin Hood. And the reason for that is, to begin with, it's a family name. Then the family gets bigger. So then they start to enter the medieval records. So needless to say, there's a few more of them. Then Hoode becomes a traditional epithet, if you like, for a criminal. So if you are a robbing hood, you are a criminal. So Hoode or Ode becomes the name for criminals. So then by the time you got to the 1300s, they're all going, I'm Robin. No, I'm Robin. Hood. And it's all over the British Isles. They're all calling themselves Robin Hood, which just means they've gone into legend, basically. That's what's happened. It's taken about 200 or 300 years for this character to go into legend. So you can see what the problem is. You've got to sort of bring in this enormous medieval leaf blower and blow them all out of the way.
Oh, sure. Anybody looking to do an article even, or, any sort of research, they're going to get pretty confused. It's pretty convoluted.
Yeah.
So, wow. Okay. So you were able to figure this out easily, of course, and move on from that. So let's start then. Who was Robin Hood?
Right. Okay. He's actually born into a family where let me get this right, his mother's previous married name was O'Malley or O'Malley.
Right.
So he marries, his mum marries a forester who we think his name is Udard or Utart. And she marries him and they have Robin. Now, this is where it gets interesting because previous marriage, she'd already produced several sons and daughters. One of those is a guy called Red Roger who eventually kills Robin to stop him from inheriting. Another one of those turns out potentially to be Will Scarlet. Okay, and his brother Will Scathelock, who is actually slightly different. So when you start to look at the family tree, you start to break that down. I can tell you what he's not. He's not some dispossessed Saxon noble. That's later nonsense that crept into it.
Right.
What he actually is, if you trace his ancestry back, you go all the way back through marriage, you finish up actually at Bishop Odo, who is the cousin of William the Conqueror. So he's actually descended. Yeah, he's descended from Normans. So by the time you actually arrive at him, I mean, you've got to understand your medieval social structure to make head and tail out of who's married to what and how they end up. In fact, I might even have the family tree in the book. Let me just see. I don't mince my words with the book. I actually put everything in here. I'll give it a plug as well while I'm just looking for the family tree.
Absolutely.
When the book was first published, the president of the Worldwide Robin Hood Society, bless him, was an American chap. And he put a review up and he basically said, and I'm just going to quote him, he said, "This is the best book on Robin Hood ever written." There you are. There's the family tree. Let me just see if I can bring that into focus.
Yes, look at that.
It looks quite complex. There we go. There we go. But Robin's, he's over here. That's Robin over here.
Right.
But you can see, if nothing else, that I've sort of at least had a good go at making sense of it.
Right.
That's
But what a wonderful compliment.
Yeah,
on the review,
because it does make sense. And out of the documentation as well. So he grows up. He spends the first most of his 15 years, call it 16 years, he's actually adopted by the Earls of Chester. Now, Chester's not normally associated, it's all Nottingham this, Nottingham that, Nottingham the other. Actually, I was only able to find out that he spent 3 days in Nottingham. Obviously, they operated around Nottinghamshire, and around the castle.
Right.
But it was only actually in the town that I could find for 3 days. But the first 16 years of his life, he was adopted by one of the Earls of Chester. So he grows up as a sort of noble page, I suppose, or assistant to the nobles. Probably he finishes up at a castle called Chartley Castle, and then from there goes up to Robin Hood's Bay, which is up near Scarborough, and he works on Scarborough Castle, linked to the O'Malley family, because the O'Malley family are actually sending most of the kids, most of the people of functioning age up there. And then we have this fabulous story. It's a great story. You're going to love it. It's not widely known, but it's called Robin Hood Goes Fishing. Right. The idea is he arrives up there, he arrives at Whitby, and they're having trouble up there with Vikings raiding, because you still got Vikings raiding in like the 1100s. That's not unusual. And this widow up there who owns ships, she's quite a wealthy lady, says to him, "Well, are you any good at sailing?" Well, Robin's like, "Well, I've never tried it, but I'll have a go." You know what I mean? Well, yeah, as we all know, it's not that simple. Anyway, he gets on this boat, so he's sailing round, and sure enough, up comes this. It's described as a French ship. So it's raiding from northern France. It's the Norsemen from northern France that are coming up and raiding on that coast. And basically what he does, he takes the other ship out with a bow. He's firing arrows ship to ship. And it's the first time we ever hear of him being anything to do with archery, being an archer.
Wow.
But he certainly would have qualified as one, because you had to practice in that, on the village green every Sunday in medieval times. But then he captures the ship, And the Viking ship he captures is worth a fortune, so he takes it back with all this booty on it and everything. And it's said that, you know, this widow is obviously overjoyed, and he uses the money to build a chapel. Now, the funny thing is, actually up there, there is actually a medieval chapel that was said to go back all the way to the days of Robin Hood. So,
Wow.
you know, it's like you come up with a story like that, you read the story and you think, oh, how on earth, you know, can I make sense out of this? And then the next minute you're actually falling over the archaeology. You know, you suddenly discover the O'Malleys are building the castle at that time.
Yes.
And of course, they were sending people up there, and even rebellion. There was, I think it's the Stephen and Matilda rebellion period over here.
Right.
He gets sent up there to fight for the O'Malleys. So you just think, oh, right, now I know why it's called Robin Hood's Bay. You know, otherwise it's completely illogical.
But
And
I mean,
go on.
You know, I was going to say, when you say like the church, I mean, going back that far, I know you know, spending time in different parts of Europe and the UK, it's not easy to find something. I mean, if you find something that's like 1200, you're like hooting and hollering, because that's impressive.
Well, yeah, I mean,
back
it's even described as an Anglo-Saxon church that was rebuilt by the Normans.
Right.
And the reason they know that is that the Victorians then came along and basically restored it. So they found all this information out.
Right.
It's been known for, you know, 100 years plus.
Yes.
But it's great to be able to piece that together.
Yes.
And then he comes back, as far as we know. Then he comes back. Now, the reason I say he was at Chartley Castle, and this is where there's no argument really, because you got Chartley, and it's a Crusader period castle, but right next to it is a Norman manor house with a moat that belonged to the Earls of Chester. So you know that you're on safe ground because you've got the archaeology to back it up.
Right.
Next to that, are you ready for this? Next to that is the medieval village of Loxley. Next to that, okay, is Tutbury, which is where Friar Tut comes from. Right. And then next to that, there's a church, a little church village, where it's said that Robin married Maid Marmion. So she's right next door. And you've got all three of those places in a straight line going straight across. You know, it's like I say, you couldn't make it up. As soon as you start to get these different elements and piece them together, you can just put them straight into the geography.
Right.
It was a fabulous.
The locations are the key, obviously.
Well,
and who is Maid Marian? Our lovely Maid Marian. Where does he meet her?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. There's a family called the Marmion family, and they're based around Abbots Bromley, which is very, very close to Chartley. It's another neighbouring village. But the Marmions actually owned all the land in that area. So if you hear of this thing, the Abbots Bromley horn dance, this legendary thing where they all come out with horns made, like headdresses made from deer horns, and they all dance around, that's the Marmion family ceremony. Now, this is putting pieces together again. They carbon dated the horns. The horns go back to the 1000s. So Robin would have seen the Marmion family's horn dance at Abbots Bromley.
Right.
Maid Marmion, it's not a huge jump to have that name convert into Marion. And when you actually go and study the Abbots Bromley horn dance, Maid Marmion is one of the characters in the horn dance, but Robin isn't, which I think is fantastic. He's not in it. They have an archer. They've got an archer, a forester dressed in green, but he's never been called Robin Hood, never, because the whole of that ceremony revolves around Maid Marian. It's Maid Marian's family, and it's her site, and it's her ceremony. So even the bits that are missing, you know, you start thinking, this fits, you know, it fits. It's brilliant. But so she was a noble lady. The funny thing is, they got together, and in medieval times, the idea was that you loved your beloved lady from afar. So you didn't sort of drag her off to church, marry her, and off you went. It didn't work like that.
Took a while.
It did take a while. So they only actually get married when they're actually quite old and they've already got a couple of kids in reality. But that happens. That is perfect. It fits perfectly well with medieval tradition, because you sort of made an honest woman of her when, you know, you weren't off fighting in crusades and, you know, all the rest of it as a noble. You sort of had this romantic love from afar. So, that fits as well. It's brilliant. We know that Friar Tuck as well from Tutbury actually officiated at that wedding, because the legend that's associated with the church, we cover this in the DVD actually in quite a lot of detail. His name is Roger. It's Friar Roger Tutt of Tutbury, and he's the one that officiates. We can even pin the year down because there was a couple of years in the 1100s when the wicked King John fell out with the Pope, and the Pope excommunicated him. And for a 6-year period, all of the churches in this country were shut. You couldn't do anything. They were closed. So there's a tradition that they got married under this big yew tree at Doveridge. It's the church in Doveridge. And it's got to be a couple of thousand years old, this yew tree. So it was pretty enormous when Robin was alive. This ancient tree.
And does it still exist today?
Yes, you can go and visit it. And this is the beauty of it. That's where they got married, under that tree, because all of the other places where you could get married were shut.
That's crazy. That's crazy. It sounds a little bit like her family had a lot of Druidism, like Druid background and traditions.
In medieval England, you still had ancient traditions persisting, especially in the monastic communities.
Yes.
And the reason for that is, well, I'm not going to mince my words. It's down to the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller continued traditions from earlier times. So like the cross, they have the red cross with the arms. That's Roman. That's known from 300 AD. The whole idea of knights, grouping together into orders, which is what they did. That's Roman again. That's another Roman idea of them coming together. Just everything they were doing was sort of Roman. The Celtic British Church as well was founded on Druidism. So a lot of the patterns that you find, churches with Gothic architecture and this, that and other, you're basically walking out of a normal life into what is a Druid grove. You've got all these trees with arms. And when you look in the Bible for guidance on how to build a church, you won't find it. It's not there. It's all Druidism, where you align it, where the sun rises and the moon rises and it sets. They're built on ancient sites that have been previously used. The wheel of the year, the colours that they use on the altar. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. The list is endless, but it's all down to the Celtic British Church.
I love that. Yeah.
Which, funnily enough, I don't cover in the Robin Hood book, but I do cover all that in the King Arthur book. So I'll get a quick plug in for that one.
You do. So we're going to let you have it.
It's all covered in that. So if you put the two together, you get a more full picture of what was going on over here at the time.
Right. So we get into Knights Templar, and I know we have to do it. We have to do it because that to me, I love the connection.
Well, if it kind of follows that if it was the Earls of Chester that brought Robin up, which it clearly was, they actually had their own court. They had their own laws. They had their own rulership, if you like, here in Chester that was separate, entirely separate from London. So what you've got to imagine is the bottom half of the country is like the blue team, because they all support the wicked King John, and Boo the villain and all that. And he's kind of connected with France, and France is trying to take over Britain at this point. So, that's where that comes from. But then the northern barons and the northern part of the country, that's the red team, because they all support Richard the Lionheart, And trapped between the two, north of the Trent, is what I'm going to call the green team, because the green team is Robin and the Foresters, and they're keeping these two sides apart. So they're basically they're sort of stealing and causing problems and worrying the blue team, while at the same time supporting the red team. Now the red team, is Templar. We know from historic records, for example, that Richard the Lionheart, there's no doubt he was a Templar. He was a major figure in the Templars at this time. Well, logically speaking, so's Robin. I'm not the first author to come up with that. There has been books written on the Templar connections that Robin has. But when you look at Robin's life, you think, well, hang on a minute, he kills a couple of Sheriff of Nottingham's, and then he gets
couple.
away with it. Yeah,
Yeah.
he gets away with it. How on earth does he get away with it? You know,
Right.
if he's some Saxon peasant living in the forest, you go and kill a nobleman, that's it, you're dead. You know,
That's true. That's
lights
true.
out. But quite the opposite. He ends up, you know, he's got the right to build a chapel, which he builds up near Whitby. And then he's also got another right to build a chapel, which he builds down here next to the A1 in Nottinghamshire. There's a church there, Ct.Min.AP, where that church is another one that's attributed to Robin. So he's got the right to build that. He's got the right to marry a noble woman, you know, he's got the right to kill off King John's enemies, you know. The best stories, I've got to tell you this, I love it, because you can pin this down to 1193. So you've got a year for this, because that's the year that Richard the Lionheart is in this country. The whole of his reign, he only spent about maybe 7 or 8 months in this country on 2 visits.
Wow.
On one of the visits, he comes up to Nottingham Castle. Now, this is in the royal records. So I'm you know, speaking from documentary records here. And he comes up here, sorts Nottingham out, because he's got loads of problems with Nottingham. Now, the legend is, this is the legend, that while he's up here, he wants to see his forests. You know, King Richard, he owns all this woodland, so he goes off to have a look round Nottingham. Anyway, he's wandering through the forest, and coming the other way is the forester who's looking after the forest, who, amazingly enough, happens to be Robin Hood. Now, Robin sees this stranger with a couple of knights wandering through the woods, and he thinks, hey, what's going on here? So he challenges this stranger. Now, basically, I'm going to paraphrase the story. He goes, oi, who are you? And this other guy goes, hang on a minute, who are you? So Robin goes, it's my forest. And the other guy goes, no, it's not, it's my forest. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, they end up on the floor in a punch up, and the knights have to pull Robin off, because they say, hang on a minute, Robin, this is Richard the Lionheart. This is the king. So
the king.
so the king throws back his hood, you know, his knightly, whatever he's wearing. He's
right.
And sure enough, it's King Richard. Well, it rings true, because, I mean, in medieval times, we didn't have any way of knowing what kings looked like.
Right.
All Robin was doing was defending his woods, like he's always done. Now, at this point, you think, okay, it's either off with his head or, you know, anyway, the king was impressed. It went the other way, and they actually befriended each other. And it's said that they went to a pub called the Old Trip to Jerusalem, which still exists in Nottingham. It's one of the oldest pubs in Britain.
Wow.
It's built into the castle wall. It's actually built into the brew house cave where they made the beer for the monks.
Amazing.
And they went there before Richard returned to crusade. And it's said that at that point, obviously, Robin was then bumped up. He was bumped up to then the level of a full-blown nobleman. You know, he was he hit the sort of upper levels.
Right. Well, he had the trust of the king.
Fantastic story.
Beat on the king and got the trust of the king.
Yeah, they ended up having this fist fight. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
which,
and get the title.
There's Robin. You can imagine Robin swearing at him in some Lancastrian dialect, you know, and the king swearing back in French, you know, because he didn't speak any Saxon or anything like that. So it must have been quite funny.
Which is, isn't that like amazing? It's much like William the Conqueror, who had the throne of England for 20 years and never stepped foot in England, but built the Tower of London and these incredible
William
places.
the Conqueror did. He sort of hung around like a bad smell for a couple of years in sort of, you know, after 1066. Yeah, he didn't really go off and do anything else. In fact, I think he ends up going back to the continent and dies in the wars there in the 1070s. But he hung around from like 1066 to around about 1073, 1074, something like that. So he kind of had a bit of an innings, but he was here.
He's an ancestor. My grandfather always used to say, you know, we're the, you know, our ancestor is, you know, a French king who sat on an English throne for 20 years and didn't visit, and so that's what I grew up hearing.
Well, I mean,
peculiar. So,
well, yeah, he did hang around a bit, but,
right, interesting.
But wasn't. I mean, you think, you know, William the Conqueror conquers the whole of Britain. Well, he never did. He never really
managed. That's another bit of folklore, of course.
Yeah, forget Wales, Ireland, Scotland, you know, all those other areas. He basically got control of England.
Yes.
and that
Yes.
was that. You know, the rest of it,
Yes.
as they say, is literally history. So,
But isn't it? It's always fun to listen to all the folklore. You know, the fish was this big, and the fish was
yeah,
this big. It was like a minnow. You know.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, this
so
idea of the blue team and the red team is really important, because at the end of the day, that never really got resolved.
right,
So that's why in this country we've got what's called the North-South divide. That's
right,
why, you know, we've got London sort of ruling the roost, and Southerners and all this, that, and the other. And then you up here, you got Chester, Manchester, Liverpool, you know, Lancaster.
right,
That's Northerners, you know, so that's the northern bit.
right,
And it's been like that for probably knocking on for 1,000 years. It's not going to change anytime soon. And then
right.
just to cap it all, further north you go, eventually you cross Hadrian's Wall, and whoa, you're in Scotland. You know, that's the yellow team up there. That's, you know, Robert the Bruce and all that lot.
Oh, they must be like really peeved off because somebody cut down their tree. It's like,
Well,
that was
yeah,
heartbreaking.
that was heartbreaking, because
Oh,
you know, that
yeah,
was a
my
major.
heart hurt when I saw that.
Which, funnily enough, takes us back to Robin Hood again, because that was in the Kevin Costner, wasn't it? Robin Hood,
Yeah.
Prince of Thieves. You know, that's
Right.
where he first meets the coloured chappie there. You know, and it was
Yeah.
played by Morgan Freeman, I think, if I remember right. Yeah,
I always love the depictions in all these films, you know. So at this point, Robin Hood now he's noble. So he's
yes,
got a title, which gives him a whole other bunch of privileges. shall
and
we say.
responsibilities, yeah, and
Yeah.
responsibilities.
Right.
When we did the DVD, that was the point at which we kind of jumped in and said, okay, that's probably round about the time when he would get married. It's also round about the time that he suddenly then officially becomes a noble under the command of Richard the Lionheart. So a lot
Which would
of
make
his,
sense. To
yeah,
marry a noble woman, you would have to, I would think, be a noble.
well, that period of his life, trying to work it out, that looks to have lasted about 16 years.
Mm.
And in that 16-year period, he wasn't just limited to, you know, Barnsdale and Nottingham and, you know, that area. He kind of wandered a bit up and down the road there on the east side of the country. So he's got more control in South Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire, coming down into Staffordshire, Shropshire. He's got controls down there, but then also he goes across the country. It's interesting because some of the legends put him in Cumbria, Cumberland,
Yeah.
which is the Lake District. Now that's on the other side of the Pennines. Now I put this to a friend of mine who was a landscape archaeologist. Now, landscape archaeologists specialize in aerial photographs and satellite images and this, that, and the other. And we were just over a cup of coffee one day, and I happened to mention to him, and I said, do you know, I just can't work this out. I've no idea why Robin Hood would have any interest in Cumbria. And he just went, well, that's because the two are connected by a Roman road. So I'm like, I can't believe it. There goes the archaeology again. So you've got this diagonal Roman road that goes straight across the Pennines and dumps you straight into Cumbria. Now, also from literature, a lot of the landowners either side of this Roman road going all the way across the Pennines, a lot of the landowners appear to have taken an interest in the stories of Robin Hood. When you start looking at where they're coming from and you look at the documentation, it's their storytellers that are perpetuating the legends. So I'm like, this is incredible, because you got backup from archaeology, you've got backup from the legends themselves, and then you've got backup from the surviving stories. That appears to be the connection between the two. And then Lady de Gavila, I think I'm saying that right, Lady de Gavila, she was one of the people who was the major landowner in Cumbria, connected again to the Barons of Chester. So you've got another connection back.
Right.
Also, it's worth mentioning as well, when he becomes a Templar, he seems to join an order which is specific to Richard the Lionheart, which is the Lion. The Lion, all the nobles that are connected to the Lion have a single lion rampant on the shields. They all have the same in different colours. So you'll have a purple lion, a green lion, a red lion, and that. Because Richard the Lionheart, believe it or not, has a red shield with a black lion. When you see the three sort of
Yes.
leopard things, that's later. They've back engineered that to put that onto his shield. When you look at depictions from the time, he's got this one single lion on it. So that was a major discovery. I never realized there was this separate order of lions of the north.
Yeah. Wow.
So that there's a revelation for all the Templar fans as well. They had a separate subdivision specific to Richard the Lionheart. The idea was that you were a follower of Christ who rose from the dead 3 days after being crucified. And in the medieval times, they believed that when a lion gave birth, the cub was dead for 3 days and then came alive. So that's what their lion represents. Now, of course, Richard made it all the way on crusade, made it all the way out to Jerusalem. He never actually went in because he said, I'm a warrior, I'm drenched in blood, I can't possibly go into the holy city. So he saw it, he got there, but he never actually entered any of the gates. And
do you think it's just because he did not want to tackle it?
No,
because volatile by then. I mean,
it was a bit of it would have been a difficult thing to do, and I think it would have upset.
Didn't he like to indulge in a little bit of the, beverages,
all sorts of stuff, royal privileges, all kinds of things. But I mean, it's said that he sent the sword of King Arthur into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, so clearly he sent people into the city. He just never went in there himself. He stopped short of going in.
But it's a really nice connection to have, because it makes him more real, I think, because there's so much. It's all folklore. It's just like Arthur, the same idea. It's folklore, it's stories, but there was never anything tangible. They can never figure out who he was, where he was buried, what his life was like. I mean, there's ruins of a cathedral somewhere in England. The name eludes me at the moment. This is where Arthur and Guinevere were buried. The monks found them, and now we don't know. The stone is gone, and I'm just like, oh, come on.
Well, there's a little bit more surviving. There's a bit more surviving for Robyn. When I was putting the book together, I'd got to the point after 4 years. I got to the point where I'm like, right, I'm gonna publish this, and then all of a sudden, somebody sent me a link to some records for Pontefract Castle, which is up here, again up north, and there was a big siege. There was this massive attack on Pontefract Castle, and what they did in the records was they listed all the defenders, and lo and behold, you know where this is going. Robyn Hood is listed with his dad as defenders of Pontefract Castle, and this is him proper.
It's just like our Robyn Hood. It's not like a descendant or.
No, this is our Robyn, and it fits perfectly. So that's it. That's going in the book. Boom, straight away, it's in the book.
Keep going.
But things like that, you start thinking, hang on a minute. It's like there's a couple of other bits where after 16 years he becomes a hermit, and he goes off to live in this cave in this abbey. So you go off and you check out the legend at this abbey, and lo and behold, it's there. They've had the same legend for 300 or 400 years written down about, this hermit, this military hermit staying in this hermitage, which is still there. And then you look at things like, okay, what was the end of Robyn? Well, the end of Robyn, believe it or not, is he's probably one of the northern barons that went down to London for the signing of Magna Carta. And you start to look at Magna Carta, and it actually says, this tickled me up when I found this out. Basically, King John had borrowed money from the Knights Templar, and the Knights Templar weren't happy with the king at all. So when all these barons turn up going, come on, sign Magna Carta, come on, give us the barons' rights. What do the Knights Templar do? They grab King John. They actually grab him, they imprison him and say, you will sign. You are going to sign. You do not have any choice. So the Templars' involvement in that is exciting, to say the least. So Robyn would have been all over that. There's no doubt about that at all. Right. And then even the king, I mentioned this in the book, even the king himself, John, he's broke, and he decides he's going to try and enlist the help of the Scots. So that's not a good idea normally, but he decides he's going to do it. Now at this point, King, I think it's Malcolm III of Scotland, is married to one of the wicked King John's daughters. So he thinks, I'm in here, it's family. I'll go and ask him for help. Now you can see what's happening because he goes all the way up the east coast. So he's over there trying to stay the hell out of this red territory. So he goes all the way up his own territory, up the east coast. When he gets to Scotland, the King of Scotland basically laughs at him and just says, "No, you've had it, mate. You're not going to get any help off me. You're a complete failure, total disaster. No money, no troops, no nothing." So he turns around, John, and starts coming back south. When he gets to the Wash, this area of bogland, that's when he famously loses his treasure. King's treasure. He loses it. He's trying to cross the Wash. He doesn't know what the tides are. And he sends his carts with all this treasure in across the Wash. And they sink. They go down in the mud. So not only is he completely broke, not only now does he have no way of paying his army and his mercenaries, he's just lost his treasure, which probably included most of his religious artifacts as well. So he's just gone down. So he ends up at Swanshead Abbey, which is just past the Wash. He ends up there, which is a Knights Templar abbey. Now, at the abbey, he tries to steal the treasure off the altar. Now, this is proper. This is real history.
This is total King John style shenanigans.
Now, in the process of stealing all of this treasure, he also kills the abbot. 3 days later, he dies mysteriously of poisoning. Now, this is where you start to get into. You're not telling me that the monks didn't have, think, right, we've had enough. We're getting rid of this king.
Exactly.
And they poison him. Now he's making a rush for, he's got this hunting lodge at Clipstone, and he's got medical assistance there, and he's safe. And so when he actually dies, he's making a rush for this hunting lodge. He's trying to get to Clipstone because he knows he can get medical help and he can be defended there. But when you look at the layout of what's going on there, it's all about Robin Hood. It's all, it's Templars, it's intrigue, it's poisonings, it's, he has to stay on his territory because he can't go and fight the foresters and get through to the other side, and it's just amazing. The whole book, everything, like I say, the actual documented written history of Britain fits perfectly, so I'm not treading on any toes in producing the book. It is quite an interesting piece of history. It takes account of all of these things happening.
Well, it's interesting because there's just not that many structures left where to collaborate some of this, unless, like you say, like the church where it was rebuilt and then restored. So was King John's treasure ever found? I mean, come on, you know where it is. You'd have to go looking for it.
Well, do you know what?
Come on now.
Well, all right, I'll tell you a story. Good. This is not in the book, but this is just me again.
Right.
I used to know a dowser who was the best dowser in Lancashire. Right. John was his name. I won't give anything more away than that. He's passed away now. He's died, but John anyway was this famous Lancashire dowser, and he made a couple of dowsing rods for me, and he helped me out on some of my archaeological this, that, and the other. And he just came out with it one day, and he just went, "I've been looking for the treasure in the Wash, and I think I found it." So I'm like, "Hang on a minute! They've been looking for this for 800 years, and he's just gone out there and he's used his dowsing rods and he's found it." I said, "Well, how do you know?" He said, "Look," he said, "I've got a DVD here," he said, "because we filmed it." And he handed me this DVD, and I'm thinking, okay, maybe he's made this up. Maybe he's gone a bit nuts, or whatever.
Right.
But, and this is it, but the Wash has silted up. So there are allotments now growing food on this silted up area where he pinpoints this treasure. And you can see in this DVD, there's an American team with a core drill. They bring in this massive core drill, and he's spray painted a cross on the ground. You know what I mean? X marks the spot. Right. Put the drill in here and we'll see what happens. So the drill goes in and the drill comes out, and they take the core out, and sure enough, I mean, it's an enormous amount of distance down. You're talking 23 foot or something like that down underground. It's miles down, far too far. But they pull the core out, they separate the core, and part way in this core is a piece of a medieval treasure chest. Wow. So he's hit it.
Wow.
Absolutely bullseye. He's gone straight through the side of one of these chests on a cart containing treasure. I think there's other bits of timber come up as well. And it all dates to the right period. And it is very clearly, you can see it in this DVD, very clearly a piece of the treasure. So he has gone down in history as being the guy who found the treasure in the wash. Now, the consequences of that, of course, is that nobody's ever going to get down that low. It's way below the water table. It's way down below 800 years of mud. But they know where it is. That's the thing. They've hit this chest, so they know where it is. From a dowser with 2 pieces of metal.
Which is phenomenal to me that he could pick it up that high up.
Well,
I mean, dowsing is phenomenal to me. I have a huge amount of respect for people who really know the craft. It's an art form. You know, a lot of people go, "Oh, we can douse." No. Some people are just, they themselves are that energy source.
Well, he has gone into history as one of the nation's best dowsers. I mean, he did it his entire life. I think he was in his late 70s or early 80s when he passed away. And that was like 10 years ago. But I've still got the DVD. I've kept the DVD. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it because it's just, well, it's a piece of history, isn't it?
Yes.
But that's my personal connection. I mean, I knew the guy, you know, and and I was one of the first to see this. It's not a commercially recorded DVD.
Right.
It's just a download of what they filmed, you know.
So I have to ask, has this ever been, like, did he ever go to any of the museums or try to get investors to even like attempt this, or is it just documented?
Well, I believe it's documented.
Right.
So it's gone into the fines record for the country.
Right.
And I think one documentary maker picked up on it at the time, but that's 10 years ago. So I don't know where that's gone. Whether it made the news or not, I mean, we have regional news items, so it may have actually gone as far as terrestrial television regional news.
Right.
But I mean, I've got all the unedited footage. It's all on this disc. I'm so pleased he gave it to me, because otherwise it would have been lost. But that's not even in the book. I mean, we've gone off piste again. We've gone.
I know, but we do that, and and it happens. It's associated, but it's kind of like off its own little thing. I find it interesting because you hear of all the stories. Okay, we'll go back on track. So he was a hero. Robin Hood was considered a hero to many people from different areas in his time. Do you think that he would still be revered as a hero?
It depends, I suppose, on your attitude.
Or are you just ruining the whole folklore, Mark?
No, I'm not going to ruin the folklore. No, it depends entirely on
playing with you.
No, it depends on your attitude towards Richard the Lionheart or King John, to be honest with you. Because the same friend of mine who found this Roman road, the landscape archaeologist, he said King John actually wasn't that bad. I said, "Oh, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, he wasn't necessarily the wicked King John. John's gone into legend as being wicked because basically he was a tax collector. He was the best, heavy-handed tax collector Britain ever had, basically. But the reason he was like that was because Richard the Lionheart was spending all the country's money. He went off and blew it all on crusades, and like you say, fancy living and, whatever.
Yes.
And was never here. So poor old John, being the next son of Eleanor of Aquitaine, he got dumped with the job that he got dumped with. Mm-hmm. So if you think John's okay, and you think perhaps that, he just died of eating too many peaches and eels up at, when he was out doing his thing to Scotland, if you kind of take that view, then Robin's a bad guy because he's supporting the rebels, he's supporting the rebellion. If, on the other hand, you think Richard the Lionheart's the good guy, which from a Templar perspective and from a crusading point of view, he's got merits. There's no doubt about that at all. Then you're going to support Robin because that's quite firmly where Robin is. And this idea that he never robbed from the rich to give to the poor, in actual fact, what he used to do was rob from the rich and then give it back to the rich, because the idea was to show people up. Because there's a particular thing where the abbot of York has taken money off a knight. So what Robin does is he goes and robs the abbot and then gives it back to the knight. So, it's all upper echelon stuff. It's not, lower down.
So the little guy really, I mean, really he was like a hero, and realistically, they got nothing out of it.
Well, yeah, in the original stories, he's quite violent. He's quite abrupt. He kills sheriffs. He kills opposition. He's quite a rough character, which makes it all the more believable. As him being a medieval forester. Was he a hero? Well, he certainly sets the tone. Anyone, I think, that goes into rebellion against the medieval crown is going to take Robin as a hero. There's no doubt about that. Especially after John. Once they got rid of John and the royalty starts, getting its act together again after that. Over here we have lots of issues, lots of things going on. And then you've got the dissolution of the Templars that starts to creep up through the 1200s. They get phenomenally powerful, phenomenally rich. They're all over the world doing everything that the Templars do. I mean, Robin, to be honest with you, he lives quite a long time. He lives well into, possibly up to being into his 90s. It's after 1215. I think it's 1217 when Robin dies. So he dies as an old guy, which makes perfect sense because, if you're a knight and you're a forester and, you're doing what you're doing, you're going to be fighting fit. You're going to be absolutely, there at the top of the game. And being a noble, he wouldn't have suffered from any of the, the difficulties that peasants had. He wouldn't be malnourished. He wouldn't be anything like that, No. So he lives a long life and he dies very late on. By which point, like I said earlier, his son takes over the mantle, as it were, and goes off and fights for the Edwards. You're in a different royal situation then, which has caused endless confusion to historians doing the research, because you've got him apparently still alive in the reigns of the Edwards. So everyone's like, oh, it's got to be early 1200s. Well, they've blown it. Basically, they've fallen into the trap that's actually his son that carried on serving royalty after his death. I think on balance, I would say he's a hero. I would say so. But not for the reason that people might think. I think he was a hero because he understood exactly how to play the game at that point in history. He was absolutely bang on the money right through his whole life. And he lived a tremendously long time, and he was incredibly successful for so many different reasons, and always stood on the right side of everything that was expected of him, which in my eyes makes him a hero,
I would think so. I think people fall in love with legends. They fall in love with folklore because especially when it comes from a time where life is so hard, everybody wants to know there's somebody fighting for them, even if he's not,
Well, I don't know. I think he did. I think he stuck up for the ordinary man.
Yes.
The fact that he was a forester, I mean, he was only a forester, but he was willing to take on the king and give him a good hiding, for being where he shouldn't be. And clearly all of his, merry men, who incidentally weren't all men, there's quite a few ladies in there as well, all of that band of people that gathered around him, they weren't nobles, they weren't all from noble families. A few of the major players were. Little John comes from the Lytell family. And like I say, the Scathelocks, the Scarlets, they come from another fairly well-known family, and so on. The Marmions, even Friar Tuck was a proper friar. He was a white canon. So he would have come from quite a high up background, but they're all out there with everybody else, if you like, standing up against John. John was the problem, taxing the North to death. So, they're sort of, how can I put it? They're nobles, but they're people who were still connected, to the general population. And the storytellers, that's how he got into legend. The storytellers just got hold of that and ran with it, I think the reason I think the reason he ended up the way he did, by the way, and the fact that all the stories have suddenly turned into legend, you can blame the age of printing for that, really, because by the time you get into the 1400s and the 1500s and the 1600s and all that, they have no idea what life was like in medieval England.
Right.
You know, they don't know that. So it's that popularization of the early legends that result in him going the way he went, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that makes sense. It fell in line with a lot of the whole, you know, grim tales and everything else. As you know, you had your heroes, you had your villains, and there's always had to be a hero, always had to be a villain. It's fascinating to me, though, that there really were the merry men. It's almost like the one part of the legend, which is, yeah, it's there. You know, so it's like there's something that holds true to the legend part of everything.
Well, it's like Little John's a good example. Heathersage, or Hathersage, if you pronounce it. There's a church there, and outside the front door of Hathersage Church is his grave, and it's always been his grave. And if you go inside the porch, his gravestone's there as well. So there's no doubt about that. We know exactly where he is. You know, Little John's bow and his hat and a few other bits and bobs used to hang in the church up to about 250, 300 years ago. So there's plenty of physical evidence for him. The Marmions, like I say, over at Abbots Bromley, I'm just talking history. You know, the Barons of Chester and Chartley and the castles they owned and all that. Again, it's history, it's archaeology. Loxley really exists. It's funny, actually, because Loxley as a name, as a village, is always associated with land owned by the Barons of Chester. So it's
so Robin of Loxley would be
would logically be there. You know, it's funny actually because I kind of, by the time I got to the end of writing the book, it was like putting together the pieces of a jigsaw. So you had, there's the Marion piece, you know, and there's the Little John piece, there's the Scarlet piece, and you know, and then you had plays that were written by Skelton for Henry VIII, and tells you all about where these characters come from and who they are and what they did, and then you had all the archaeology, all the geography, you know, all these pieces coming together, and you were just left with this one piece in the middle that was Robin Hood shaped. And the rest of the jigsaw puzzle doesn't make any sense till you put that last piece in. So it's like you can prove everything else. Everything else is a doddle, absolute doddle to prove everything else. But trying to nail that one piece, that one bit that's Robin Hood, that was the hardest bit to do of the entire book, was just nailing him down, you know, and getting some factual information. But, and this is the real point of it all, I did it. I did actually achieve that, because the book is quite long. It's not short, you know. It's it's a decent length. Yeah.
So how did Robin die?
Okay, there's two stories. There's two. In fact, it's a nice, brilliant question. Great conclusion to this. Okay,
you had to know I was going to ask.
Well, yeah, I knew it was
minds.
coming. Apparently, you've got this legend that's associated with Kirklees Priory. And I'll tell you what the legend is, okay? The legend is that he goes to Kirklees Priory because he's feeling a bit ill, and it's run by one of his relatives. The abbess there is one of his relatives. But this relative is knocking off another one of his relatives called Red Roger. This is where Red Roger of Doncaster comes in. Now, basically, Roger is going to inherit everything that Robin, you know, has the potential to inherit if Robin is out of the way. Now, I've only found that out by looking at the family trees with the characters involved. So basically what he does is he bribes the abbess and says, when you come to bleed Robin, just leave him and let him bleed to death. Which, I mean, bleeding was a regular process. They used to do that quite regularly with leeches and all sorts of things, little knives in medieval England. So he goes to Kirklees and he's there, and she leaves him to die. Now, he twigs what's going on, but he twigs what's going on just a bit too late. And when Little John comes to visit him, Little John realizes that he's actually on his deathbed. So Little John lifts up Robin. Robin gets hold of his bow and he says, where this arrow lands, that's where you're to bury me. So he goes, "Pdoing," fires this bow, and where the arrow lands, that's where they bury him. Now, at this point, the whole story just goes and falls apart. There's no way on God's earth that someone's been that's about to be bled to death can pull a 160-pound draw weight yew longbow and loose an arrow which when you go to Kirklees, you look where the grave is, it's like 400, 500, 600 meters. There's no way you could possibly have fired that. Now, the grave, and this is the beauty of it, in the 1700s, the owners of the estate decided they were going to dig this grave up and settle it once and for all to find out whether Robin was buried there. Now, this is beautiful because this is antiquarian archaeology. This is way before the days of proper archaeology. So they get stuck in with the shovel, and guess what they find? Not only do they not find a burial, they actually find nothing. Nothing at all. Not even a hole.
Wow.
There's not even a hole under this grave. There's just nothing. It is, the whole thing is a folly. It's completely fake. And the other thing with the name Kirklees, Church Lees actually just means a church in a field. So when it says in the Robin Hood legends that he's buried at Kirklees, it could literally be anywhere. However, through a lot of research and the work of this poet called Skelton, who went through all the records in the 1500s, he's a star, loves Skelton to bits, because he's writing for Henry VIII, you know, so if he gets any of this play wrong, Henry's just going to be off with his head, you know, you don't argue with Henry VIII. So he writes all this detail down, and he also writes down the last words of Robin Hood. So we've lost all of his original documents. They've all gone, but we've still got his play. Now, it says, I want to be buried under the abbey walls in Wakefield. And it says that in this play, in this Skelton's play, it says Wakefield. Now, this was a big problem because you're looking at Wakefield and you're going, well, hang on a minute, there's no abbey. There's no records of any medieval abbey. So where on earth is he buried? Fast forward to 2016, and they're renovating the abbey. And the archaeologists dig up the floor to find that there's a medieval abbey under the floor. Yay!
Oh.
And guess what? There are 3 burials. They analysed 3 of the burials, and they're all skeletons from the time of Robin. They tie up exactly with Robin's death date in the early 1200s. So we know that they were building that abbey at Wakefield at precisely the exact time that Robin was buried. Now, talk about coincidence. At that point, I'm just wrapping the book up. So I had to put that in. I had to put it in. So you're talking proper archaeologist, proper archaeology, analysis of bone remains, you know, archaeological report of excavation. It'll never be done again because they've now laid the floor and sorted all of that out. But that's where Robin is. I'm convinced of that. He's under the floor. He's where he says he was in Wakefield. Now, he's not. I don't think he's one of the 3 burials that were up at the top level, but I certainly think he's there. You know what I mean? He's there adjacent to one of those walls.
Right,
now,
so it's not marked, unfortunately.
Well, and if they'd have found it, there would have been a sword, some arrow tips, and possibly the remains of his bow, because he was buried with all of those. Now then, this is going to make the hair on your body stand on end, because when they did this part of the abbey up, right, they decided they were going to put this floor in, and it's a beautiful floor, beautiful pattern floor. But then they had to replace the altar in that part of the church. So where these skeletons were and where the medieval abbey actually ends, where the original altar would have been, they decide they're going to put this massive square wooden table. Now, it's a big table. It's probably about, 3 meters by 3 meters. So they walk in with this table and they go, let's put this in. And when you look at the table, it's a giant Templar cross.
Come on.
And it's right over the place where he's supposed to be buried. Now, you look at that and you think, now, hang on a minute, who knew what about what? You know, who's been talking?
Right.
My book wasn't in print at that point. Now, it's in the DVD, it's in the documentary. So folks go and check out Life and Times of the Real Robyn Hood on YouTube.
I will.
Closing section of that. I mean, we look at a couple of different possibilities for where he might be buried, but the last shot of me walking out of Wakefield, you've got this enormous, Templar cross altar right there at the front of the shot. You can't miss it. So honestly,
you think he's under the altar? That somebody
Well, if
knows
he's not directly under the altar, then he's certainly within, a couple of meters
within
of
there.
where they put it, and that's where he is. He's under the medieval parts of that abbey at Wakefield. That's where I think he is, absolutely. And as far as I know, I'm the only person to actually come out and say that. So that's exclusive.
To put that kind of an altar down, so whoever put it there must have had some inkling. Like, it makes you wonder, did the information through the family, perhaps within the circle, all these connected dots all come into within the circle and pass the story down? Somebody knew.
Yeah.
Somebody knew, because somebody would have had to inter him.
Well, yeah, somebody would have had to bury him, and somebody would have had to record his last words. It's a shame, because I think it's the last couple of words in that part of the play have gone. They've disappeared. So it gives you some of his details, but the last word, literally the last thing he said before he died, is not recorded because it's been lost. But we have enough information, to know what was going on. I think a lot of the documents were lost during the dissolution of the monasteries and things like that, when all the libraries were destroyed. And then again, you've got Oliver Cromwell, English Civil War. So, that comes along in the mid-1600s. So much of the background information that Skelton had access to has gone, but he did a good job of putting together the information that he did put together, because he gathered as much as he could find at that time. I mean, this is a brilliant thing as well. If you want to be a Robin Hood scholar, okay, the surviving documents, are you ready for this? There are 7 of them. That's it. So whereas there was 800 and odd I had to go through to do King Arthur, I mean, that was ridiculous. It took years and years. There are only actually 7 surviving documents that can be dated before about 1450. So that's it. That's all you've got. That's everything you've got to work with. So in that sense, putting the legendary side of it together, that was relatively straightforward.
Right. So there's a photo that is, of course, floating around online where it's supposed to be the grave of Robin Hood. Have you seen that one?
It will probably be 1600s. That's the 1600s one. Nathaniel Johnson, or is it Nathaniel Book? I'd have to look it up. Anyway, his name's Nathaniel. It's 1663, I think it was. He did an engraving of the grave of Robin Hood. Now, the problem with that is that it's a stone. It's basically a tombstone. Right. And all we can tell is that it had an inscription around it, and the cross on it is Templar. That's all we can tell. But that stone could have been brought from anywhere. Do you know what I mean? Right. It's more likely to be a leftover stone from Kirklees Priory. It's just something that's been hanging around in the priory, and they've ended up, that's where it's ended up. But the cross does look remarkably similar to the one that's on the tomb of Little John. The 2 crosses look like, someone's having a go at the same order, using the same iconography, which is interesting.
Right. So if Robin's son, Robin Jr. goes on and basically takes over the helm, would Robin's followers have followed him as well? And could this have added to additional confusion?
Well, there is actually a group of archers in London, believe it or not, who then call themselves Robin Hood's men. So there's no reason why Robin Hood's men wouldn't have grouped together up here in Nottingham. That would have happened as well. Right. So I said this when I did the Arthur book, at the end of the day, what you've got to do is take all these pieces of information and then put them in date order. It frustrates the living daylights out of me when people write books and then they don't try and make a chronology out of the information, what came before what. So people have made this assumption that, the band of merry men carried on and, on and on and on and on and so on. But it's only when you actually link them all together and you look at the dates that you start to realize that most of them are actually later than his son, So there's him in the 1100s, then his son's alive in the 1200s. And then, like I say, you get exactly the effect you would expect. Everything then starts to get bigger and bigger. So if you imagine Robin is the tip of a pyramid, then the pyramid gets bigger and bigger. So there are more and more and more references to Robin Hoods, you know, and people call Robin and Hood and Ode and Odo and Hode and so on, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's a bit like, you know, once Star Wars came out, everybody's son was called Luke. You know, it's that kind of, you know, it's the same thing.
Well,
you know,
I think also as descendants move into different areas, especially if you go overseas, you know, the name splits because there's so many, so they'll change it. And this is where so many people lose that ancestral stuff, because it's like, wow, you know, our name over here was this, and we're just like, well, that's a pretty far cry between the two. And it makes you wonder if they, you know, as they started moving out throughout the country, if they just started.
You've got an interesting coincidence as well, and that is a friend of mine who was studying the Barons of Chester.
Right.
Totally different. She's an academic. All she does is study records for Staffordshire. So she ran across these records of the Barons of Chester. So she started looking at that. And then she started noticing where the barons had land. Now, barons, after William the Conqueror, ended up owning patches of land all over the place. The first thing she noticed was that all over these patches was the name Loxley. But the second thing she noticed was the name Hode or Hood popping up in all of these areas. And she said, oh, I wonder why that is. So she went off and did a bit more research. Guess where the Chester storytellers end up going? They end up, the bards, the storytellers, the, you know, performers and people that do plays of Robin Hood and all this. They're doing them on the same land that's owned by the Barons of Chester. So the earliest names of Hode and Ode and all the rest of it, like you say, move to the areas that are then associated with the barons. And then only from there do they start to then spread elsewhere. But it's very much like moving country to country. They're moving county to county.
Yeah. Yes.
Same
so
process.
Then he would have gone by the name. There was like Loxley being an association to him as well.
Well, yeah. So it's
aside
actually,
from just the town.
Yeah, when you get to the end of the 1200s and you're tipping into the 1300s, you could have Robin of Loxley in Sussex.
Well, I think they made a film, and that's what.
Yeah, you could have Robin of Loxley in Cheshire, then you have Robin of Loxley in Nottinghamshire, you know, and they're everywhere because they are, you know. It's exploded. You know, it's become a popular movement.
It seems to go in cycles as well. You have the diehards who have been at this, like, you know, the whole time because the interest is there, and then you just have these that cycle through. You know, like the show could air, for example, and then you'll have people out there who's like, well, I wonder if that's true. I wonder if I can go visit this place. I wonder if I can find additional information. But I guess, you know, is there any additional information to find, or do you think you've pretty much found it all?
I think I've sort of nailed it all. I think I've probably got the principal pieces of the oldest surviving information. But as with everything else, I don't think I've got 100%. I think there will be more out there. In fact, I think I expect more to turn up. I mean, two areas that I didn't investigate perhaps as much as I should. One was military, because during the Wars of the Roses in the 1400s, the Nottinghamshire archers had a black and white checkered flag, which is Templar colours, with Robin Hood embroidered in the centre in green. So the archers of Nottingham were actually militarily fighting under the banner of Robin. So that's like, oh, clearly there's more to be done there, you know, military. And then there's court records then from Nottinghamshire in the, again in the 1400s, where there's this trial where this person's being tried as a bandit. And it's in the legal records, it actually says, he was committing banditry, if you like, as if he were the band of Robin Hood. So it's there in the legal records as well. So within a couple of 100 years of Robin's lifetime, the military are using it, and so's the court system. So I think there's more to be found there as well. I think there's more overlaps, which may go back further than the 1400s. You know, that's an avenue I didn't pursue to its full extent, I don't think.
Well, I think then you're falling into where everybody else does. You're probably going to be
Yeah.
getting a lot of, you know, crossed over information and dealing with descendants and so on. As an archaeologist with connections,
As we all have.
right? We'll leave it there. Um, aren't you a little bit curious? Like, I know in England, like many European countries as well, when you excavate, when you go in and it's a historical site, you excavate everything before you build over it. I mean, do you think this is a pretty historical figure in England's history? Just like when they found Richard III under a parking lot. I mean,
Yeah.
isn't there an urge somewhere in there to find this guy?
If I had the funding to do it, because that's always the case.
Big money.
If somebody came along and said, yeah, we really like what you've done, we like your documentary, we like your book, we're going to do a program on this and take it to the next level. So let's say somebody came in. There is technology now that we could x-ray the floor and have a look properly. The ground penetrating radar, the geophysics, etc. It's advanced now to a point where we could certainly have a look at other additional burials under the church, under the floor in Wakefield. No doubt about that at all. There are a couple of other sites as well that I'd really like to go and have a look at. I'd like to have a nosy at. That are associated with Robyn. So there's definitely an investigation there. It could be taken archaeologically to another level. But it's just a budget consideration. That's all it is. Literally, it's just down to.
But would you have permission to be able to do something like that? Because especially when you're dealing with another abbey on top of it, like they're pretty protective of their.
I think you started this question with that magical word archaeologist. I think if it was a production where I was involved, I've got ministerial qualifications. I am a vicar. That's what I am. So I can deal with the ecclesiastical establishment. And I can also deal with the archaeological establishment. And to some extent also, fortunately, with television and production. I'm okay with that as well. So because all those things come together, I think if I was involved in what they were doing, or somebody at least with the same skill set, I think they would probably go, I wouldn't mind. Yeah, go on,
I
have
think
a go.
it would make for a good production. I'm surprised that, you don't have somebody from like, History or Sky coming along and saying, oh, okay, we'll fund this because yes, we would love to get more information. My curiosity in finding, the grave of Robyn Hood is like you say, yes, he would be buried with certain things like a sword or like, his bow. But it would make you wonder if he was buried ceremoniously, like in a ceremonial way, like the Templars would bury you. And that would really be something to see because that just sort of ties everything in a nice little bow, the big old knot on it.
I mean, generally speaking, people like to turn things into legends.
Yes.
But they don't like to go the other way. They don't like legends to turn into reality. That's something I've discovered over the years. So, there were some folks most people have been quite accepting of the King Arthur book, but there has been critics. I'm glad to say most of the critics are not academics. So, but people don't like that, to be converted into reality. Robyn Hood is a good example. If we actually found Robyn Hood and we go, hey, there he is, it somehow it takes the gloss off the legend. I mean, the new book I've just got out now, Europe's Roswell 40 Years Since Impact, which looks at UFO crash debris. I think we've covered that.
We did that one the last time, didn't we? Yeah.
Who wants to know that UFOs are real? People prefer to have them as a legend, as a ghost, as an image.
I don't know, because now we've got disclosure. Now people now I think have had time to digest it, and they want it. They want to know more about it because they're curious. When you're looking at something like a legend, such as Arthur or Robyn Hood, legends is like you say, they want to believe in a hero. They want to believe in something that's grander, perhaps, than what it is. And I agree. I think if you take it to the point where it's like, yeah, a real guy here lived, breathed, ate, drank, had a wife, had a child, it's not, it's not like the beautiful love affair Maid Marian and King John always trying to steal her away. Like there's so much to it all.
You're right. It's quite brutal. I mean, it's quite brutal because
Yeah.
he didn't get married. He had kids out of what we would regard as out of wedlock.
Right.
He killed people. I mean, he kills one of the bounty hunters that comes looking for him, cuts his head off, and sticks the severed head on the end of his bow. So he's quite brutal.
Yeah, he was nasty as well.
He nasty as well. He beats up the king. He kills monks in another story. He is rough. He is a very, very rough character, very hard. But those were the times he lived in. Even the King John thing. Is it a murder mystery or isn't it? Queen Victoria, who actually wrote her own family history and included King John, actually forbade some of the information that the researchers found from being released. She stopped it. She said, you're allowed to put out he died of, food poisoning, but you're not allowed to put out the side where they're saying he was poisoned. And there's equal evidence for both. Trust me, there really is. So there is this element of cover up, trying to make everything sparkly and glossy. But now we've hit the 21st century. I think in a sense, perhaps the pendulum is swinging the other way and people want to know the truth. That's the driving force behind disclosure, but there needs to be archaeological disclosure as well. We need to get real,
I agree.
Which I think is probably my reason for, having a go at Arthur and having a go at Robin Hood, and I'm working on another book now that does the same thing for Jesus as a character. Starts looking at the real version of him. That's going to go down like a pig in a synagogue, if you don't mind me saying so.
Like a lead balloon.
I can feel it going now. I'm working on a Templar book as well that they might end up getting merged. The working title's Keys to the Temple. And that's looking at issues as well, which are coming very sharply into 21st focus at the moment.
Wow,
so
we certainly like controversy here. So.
Well, the funny thing is that the irony is the book about Jesus, I've been working on that as long as I have the Arthur book. It's about 40 odd years again that I've been working on that one.
That's a big pill to swallow, only because, the faithful, and it's not like you're dealing, but I mean, Arthur, Joseph of Arimathea, I mean, you've got major connections there, and people could say, yeah, we're okay with this. This is okay. But now, wait
till I drop the next one. That is going to be quite interesting. It's going to take me a while to do, so I don't expect anything anytime soon, but it's coming together.
Right.
It's definitely coming together.
And same with Templar stuff. We love Templar stuff.
Well, the Templars, the thing with the Templars is when they got out to the Middle East, when they actually arrived there, in 1099 on the First Crusade, they suddenly discovered what the reality was in their time. It was nothing like they'd been told. The church view of that whole story and the material and the Gospels, the Bible, and they get out there and they start finding that there's actually some bits that didn't make it into the Bible. The Sufis, the Islamic scholars are telling them different things. All of a sudden there's no snow and a manger in Bethlehem at Christmas. None of that. It's a grubby, dirty old cave in the middle of a desert. It's the reality check that the Templars got created the Templars. And we are back on subject here. That's why the Templars were the way they were, and they went the way they did. And I think that's why in the end the Catholic Church was like, guys, we can't really support you any longer. Let's just
take from the belief,
take you off the world stage.
Right.
I think they regretted doing it. Don't get me wrong. I think the Catholics at the end, they put it in records that they said we can find nothing wrong, with these guys.
Yes, that's
so
right.
It was political. It was economic. That was the stitch up at the end.
Of course.
But
the Templars are keepers of knowledge.
They
absolutely. they practiced the old ways, and they
Yeah.
held on to knowledge from different cultures because they were all part of different cultures.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I'm thinking of calling it Keys to the Temple, because at the end of the day, they understood some of the basics, like the soul, living in the head, which is a Celtic belief,
Yes.
the origins of the Grail, which at the end of the day is communion, which actually goes all the way back into the BC period, into the Old Testament.
Right.
There's all of that sort of thing they understood.
Mhm.
The idea of carrying swords, for example, Jesus actually tells the disciples to go and buy swords to defend themselves. So
Right.
you could say, well, there's the words of the master.
Right. True.
I mean, he drank, he hung out in pubs, he hung out with prostitutes and tax collectors.
Things are not always, you can't always take it literal when you read something, especially when you go that far back. Sometimes it was metaphors, sometimes it had more to do with symbolism.
Can't wait
on your page, Mark.
Yeah, I can't wait to put this book out. I mean, some of the things I've dug up are interesting. What I decided actually mentally, because you can imagine, I mean, like there's 800 odd different books you'd have to read for Arthur. You can't imagine how many books there are for the Bible. There's thousands of them.
Oh.
So I had to put a stop to it. So
Right.
I said, when we get to Constantine the Great, when you're going into the 300s, I think I'll stop at that point. Anything written after that point it's coloured by Constantine and the legalization of Christianity.
Right.
It's Romanized.
But his mother's quest for the holy relics is extremely interesting.
Well, I can include all of that. I mean, that's acceptable because they were building what they were doing based on what was going on in the 200s. That was their culture.
Yes.
But if it's from 0 to 100, 100 to 200, or 200 to 300 AD, then I'm going to include it. So you've got Dead Sea Scrolls, Nag Hammadi Library, all the extra. But then there has to be a cutoff. You've got to say.
So you're going to tackle Gnosticism as well?
Oh yeah, I will tackle the Gnostics.
Right.
That's
because that came on to be, the Essenes from that point, and the Cathars and the.
Well, it kind of goes in two directions, because do you know what? Scholarly, when you start getting scholarly, the jury's out as to who's connected to who, and it's interesting because with the Gnostics, they've put out the bits that they want to put out because commercially, fantastic, we'll sell books. But the rest of Gnosticism, there's a lot there that's hidden that they haven't put out. The Gnostics had some amazing material.
Well, the stuff they put out was amazing, so I can't imagine what they were keeping to themselves. But then you're getting into Moloch and things like that.
Oh, once you start finding it out, it makes total sense out of the Templars.
Well, let's face it, Moloch is now at the Vatican.
Well,
I'm sorry, they put a statue out there. There's something going on with that.
The overlaps with the Old Testament. So don't just look at the AD, look at the BC. There's stuff going on from the BC period.
Yeah, I prefer the older text, which brings us, kind of full circle to what we were talking about as far as legends. Is our information has been suppressed. Yeah. I think we've been taught fairy tales and oral history, and a lot of oral history is just that, oral history. And sometimes it branches off and people take from it what they want, and the truth gets lost in the shuffle. And it's hard to unravel all of that. So kudos for doing that, because that's.
I call it literary archaeology, because I mean, if you're in a hole with a trowel and you're digging back in time, the deeper you go, that's what you're after. You're after the layers. You're after an explanation. You're pulling, an archaeological site apart based on its history going further back. Yes. You can do exactly the same thing with literature. With the written records, you can do the same. You can go back and you can literally get rid of the stuff that they couldn't possibly have done, and then you're left with things that they could possibly have done, and then you go and find the source material and you start to pick through that, take out bias, take out, like you say, blind alleys, rabbit holes people have gone down, get rid of all of that nonsense, and most critically, try and stick to your source material. That's the academic side of it, really, is getting hold of the oldest possible source materials, which I'm glad to say, biblically speaking, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, there's been tons of new stuff coming out all the time. Absolutely loads of source material. So I think it's time, for the benefit of the 21st century, I think it's time to make sense of it.
I think the public is demanding, you know, a degree of truth as much as they're going to give us. But I also believe the powers that be are relinquishing a little bit more here and there, but so is archaeology. So
Yeah,
are these structures that are just sort of surfacing,
yeah,
because, whatever the case may be, all of a sudden, wait, that's not a mountain, it's a pyramid. Or, technology is allowing us to find structures beneath the waves,
yeah,
beneath the, forest canopies, out of place artifacts are showing up where things are happening. I believe, as I say, I believe the planet has a way of giving up her secrets, and maybe things that were important to hide way back then are not as important. So we're allowed to have little tidbits now.
yeah, yeah. You've just got to be careful because
Yeah.
those powers that be have changed the game a little bit. They're playing a slightly different game, and the slightly different game is disinformation. Just
Yes.
be very careful of the disinformation, because one minute you might have a piece of information that there's a pyramid somewhere and it's dead right,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden you've got like 8 or 10 or 20 odd others that are not. That just
Right.
pile in on top, go, hey, we've got one of those. Yeah, we've got one too. Oh,
Right.
look, there's another one over here.
Everybody
I'm
just
not,
wants to mask it and take away from the significance
yeah, so
just to get you to change gears a little bit.
yeah, if you take interest in any of these things,
Yes.
just push into the stories that little bit further and
Yes.
just try and find out what the background information is. I mean, I do it, but I'm sure if everybody did it, they,
Right.
The truth will out in the end, and that's what happens. People do find out which bits are right and which bits
Hey,
are wrong.
sometimes things are hidden in plain sight. Other times you do have
Absolutely.
to dig, and you can't take it at face value. You really have to do your own research.
Well, it's like 500 years ago, the bloke Skelton writing that play, and he put, Wakefield. That's 500 years ago. And then all of a sudden, whoa, 500 years later, it turns out to be Wakefield. You know what I mean? But we've just gone 500 years of,
Right.
rubbish movies and Men in Tights and,
Yes.
you name it. We've gone through all this rubbish for years and years. And all of a sudden, it turns out that actually the truth was right in the first place. That's where we started. So I think that's going to happen a lot in the 21st century. I think lots of, I'm not going to knock anybody's career, but there's lots of people out there who are not particularly good pseudo-archaeologists. And I think a lot of that will just vanish over time. And the only stuff you're going to be left with, forget the name, forget the face, forget all that, because the truth is the material itself. And certainly on my journey, the more truth I found out, the more shocking and intriguing and mysterious the truth has turned out to be.
It's so
like,
exciting.
whoa, whoa.
Yeah, it's so exciting. I think people, there are folks out there that would be just like, oh, I couldn't just sit there in a hole all day and scrape. And, I mean, I've done it, just at being invited to dig in a hole for 8 hours when I was on vacation. I didn't want to be at the beach with a bunch of people. I just sat there watching. They must have felt sorry for me. They're like, "Oh, come on down," and I was able to fiddle around a little bit. And I'll tell you, like 8 hours later, the sun was going down, and I didn't want to stop. I think when you find something and you lay your hands on something historical and old, and you just know that it was a part of something. To me, I always say something great because it managed to survive.
Oh, the same thing, the same identical process and the same feeling is true of dealing with documentation. Because I was reading, what was I reading the other day? I was reading a gospel translation that's only recently come out because they've only just found it. It's a Coptic manuscript, and they've pulled this translation off it. And there are some quotes in there which are interesting. And the way this translation's been put together, it's like a notebook. So it's got the sayings of Jesus in there, but they're not linked. You know what I mean? Somebody's just gone, well, there's one over here, we'll have that. There's another one over here, we'll have that. Joe down the road remembers this. Bill remembers this. Debbie remembers this, and so on and so on. And all they've done is just written them all out as a list. But some of these are not the ones you've ever seen before. So stumbling on something like that, and then it's either 1st or 2nd century. So you're looking at source material at that period. Because clearly it's I mean, John, who wrote John's Gospel and Revelation and a few other things, he only died at like the age of 90 odd. So you're either side of 100 AD, he drops dead. Everything after 100 AD is only one generation.
Right.
These people met, saw, heard, talked to eyewitnesses. Mm-hmm. So, for me to find that, I'm like, great. As an archaeologist, I've never dug up gold or silver. I've never found anything like,
right.
gold and treasure. But for me, that's treasure. That's finding treasure. Something like that, it's like, wow. And once that happens, you're hooked. That's it. Then I'm in danger of becoming a recluse, a hermit, disappearing. Nobody's going to see me for the next 2 years, because I'm going to be far too busy doing the research.
Well, you best keep in touch with that, because we know there's some good stuff coming.
Oh, yeah, trust me, there will be. There'll be plenty of stuff coming.
I love it, and I've certainly loved, our afternoon. It's always informative. It's a lot of fun. We bounce around, but somehow everything we sort of bounce around comes back to the topic. Somehow relates, and I love that about conversing with you. It's always informative on so many different levels.
Now you've got the book on screen.
Yes.
I would just say to anybody that's searching for either the program, the documentary on YouTube, or they want to buy the book, take note of the way we spelled Robin Hood. It's ROBYNHOODE, because we had to do that because there's so many other books called Robin Hood out there. We had to make the Life and Times cover unique, but it's a beggar to search for. We never thought about putting that name into a search engine. So if you want to go find it, make sure you spell Robin Hood the way it's spelt in Old English, and you'll be okay. You'll find it.
Is this how his name was actually spelled?
Yeah, that in the majority of the documents, that's how it ends up coming out. Because his last name was Ode, and of course the H was then added to make it Hode or Hood.
Right.
And then Robin back then was spelt with a Y, not with an I. So that's pretty right.
A lot of the old texts were like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Like they didn't have the I. Like even, for example, vampire was actually with a Y, not an I. Just, the old English, old speak. I love that. But so, okay, we know you've got books coming up. Do you have any speaking engagements coming up? Anything like that as we wind down here?
At the moment, what I'm doing is I'm doing as many interviews as I possibly can. So if people just go and do a search, I'm out there. I'm all over the place at the moment. And this year in particular, I've decided to tackle a few subjects I've not tackled before. So there's one out there on the mythology of Star Wars. There's one on Did We Land on the Moon? There's trust me, some great extra material that are only one-off. They're sort of, at the moment. You
should be sending me said extra material.
We'll talk more of this later. So I'm doing plenty online. All the back catalogue is out there now as well. Go onto YouTube through a company called Drake, Michigan. Lost Treasures is out there, all 22 episodes plus 6 extras. All the documentaries are out there now. There's absolutely tons of stuff now gone on YouTube, only in the last few months. Because I was determined by the end of this year I was going to get as much out there as I possibly could. So in the last 18 months, I think I must have put out probably close on to 100 interviews. There's probably, I'm just thinking about it, maybe 50 or 60 back catalogue things that have gone onto YouTube. And 3 books. Managed to get 3 books out in the last 18 months.
Wow.
So, stuff is...
I love it. I love it. Well, I have to wind us down and hold tight. So everybody, again, you are listening to the pre-recorded version of our show this evening, and we are winding down. Big thank you to Mark Olly. I have to say this was a very enlightening experience, as always. The life and times of the real Robin Hood, and get it, ROBYNHOODE. For those of you who are listening, do a search on that. Big thank you to Folgers Coffee as well, who sponsor our show tonight and every night. Thank you. Big thank you to Justin Snicker, aka Dr. Snick, the Sonic Surgeon, for our intro and outro. Big thank you to Steve McGinnis for all of the artwork here at the show. And Next week, well, actually, I shouldn't say next week. I'm ahead of myself. I apologize. Tomorrow night, we're going to be bringing back Dan Baldwin and George Sewell, who will be discussing their newest book, Paranormal Pendulum 3. And the part that I'm looking forward to is the Sky People in contact with Native Americans. So that's going to be good. I love that stuff. Anyway, thank you. Good night. And good night to you, Mark, because I know it's night over there.
It is. Thanks for having me. It's heading for
Pleasure.
8 o'clock over here.
See? Pleasure as always, and I hope we will do it again soon.